This is the Dean Abbott podcast. Today I'm talking to Jennifer Greenberg. Jennifer is the author of two books, Not Forsaken and Defiant Joy. She's an advocate for children in the church and equips church leaders to handle abuse wisely. Well, thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me on, Dean.
To get ready for this, I listened to two of the many podcast episodes you've done in the past.
Oh, cool.
And it seems like you, and especially in your book, you've told your story publicly before, but what if, I'm sure not everyone knows you, so why don't you just give us the nutshell version of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a child abuse survivor. I grew up in the church. My family attended conservative Christian Reformed churches, OPC and PCA, my entire childhood. My dad even taught Sunday school on occasion. And we were also involved in the homeschool movement. My parents taught art and science classes. So we were very involved in the church and Christian communities. But in private, my dad was very violent and predatorial. And so it was a very confusing way to grow up.
Now, when you say predatorial, you mean he was sexually abusive?
Sexually predatory, yes, sexually abusive. Mostly, I think with pornography, he would do things like he would save pornography to the computer that I used to do my homework, and so I'd, 9, 10, 11-year-old me would go and, get on my computer and go to write a book report or something, and I'd see some sort of graphic and oftentimes violent pornography.
Mm.
And so it was psychologically very confusing and spiritually very confusing too, because one of the things, that when we're kids, we really look to our parents and especially our fathers to model what biblical manhood, what godliness means. That's one of the reasons why I think, God calls himself our Father. And so I always found that very confusing. Why would God call himself our Father when men, fathers are scary and predatorial and dangerous? And so I always envisioned God as being this really scary, angry God.
Let's stop for just a second. I want to pursue something. You mentioned that that a part of your father's sexual abusiveness was exposing you to pornography. And
yes,
I think many people do not understand the prevalence of pornography and almost unwilling or at least unrequested exposure to pornography as a part of every kind of sexual abuse grooming.
Yes, yeah.
Every story I've heard from anyone, basically, it begins with the exposure to pornography. And I think maybe especially in the church world,
yeah,
that going to someone and saying, I'm being abused because he leaves pornography around, I'm not sure lots of people would immediately understand why that is abusive.
Yeah.
Why is it abusive?
Well, for one thing, especially when you're talking about a young child, what that does in the child's mind, especially when you're talking about pornography that portrays teenage girls or women who look like teenage girls, it teaches the child to view themselves as prey, as someone who is less than human, as someone who is a product that exists to sate the sexual desires of the abuser. I very much did not view myself as an equal with men. I viewed myself as someone who was created to sexually please men. My dad even told me at one point that I was a piece of meat and that the only thing men would ever view me as is a piece of meat, and I needed to get used to that. And porn really reinforces that lesson. You know, women and, you know, sometimes children, boys, men, are viewed as less than human, as objects. And, you know, so sexuality and sexual desire and sex itself then becomes a narcissistic thing. You know, it's all about the needs of the person looking at it. It has nothing to do with the feelings or the safety or the desires or the intellect of the person in the photo. And so it's very dehumanizing. And it teaches not just the victim, but also the abuser that this is a normal way to look at other people. And I think that is just on a profoundly spiritual and psychological level. It's very dangerous. It's just kind of creeping sociopathy, if you will.
And it makes the victim tolerate other forms of abuse.
Absolutely, because, you know, if you believe that you deserve all these things, if you believe that these things are normal, you know, or that you were created to please or to serve someone else, then basically you won't complain when almost anything happens, especially if you think that those things are normal. And a lot of the pornography that my dad was looking at was violent. And it didn't start that way, but a lot of it became very violent, and especially in my teen years. And so I really thought that sex was violent and, you know, and that it didn't need to be consensual and that it didn't need to be any kind of uh, mutual thing, that it was, you know, essentially that rape was normal, that abuse was normal. And so when we normalize abuse, not only does it make the victim incredibly susceptible and vulnerable and compliant, but it also gives the abuser a sense of entitlement and permission to live out whatever fantasy they have in real life. And that is just extraordinarily dangerous.
Your first book is all about your father and this story.
Hmm.
And in the interviews I heard with you previously, you never said where your father is now.
Yeah, I mean, he's still alive. He's not in prison. And so I kind of keep that information private, but um, he is alive. He doesn't live near me. Um, he did get kicked out of our family home, you know, by the police at
Mm-hmm.
one point, for I think it's classified as domestic violence. There was a violent incident, and children were present. But anyway, so yeah, so he's around, but I don't have any contact with him
You
at
don't know if
all.
he's read your book?
I actually do know that he
Mm.
has.
Okay.
Yeah, when Not Forsaken was in the editing phase, one of the things that my publisher was very concerned about was um, protecting my integrity and making it possible for me to share my story without any concerns for, say, family members or my abuser calling me a liar, you know, falsely accusing me, or, you know, filing frivolous lawsuits just to harass me. And you know, and abusers will do that.
Yeah.
There's patterns of these people harassing their victims by filing lawsuits, calling them a liar. And so what we did, or what my publisher did actually, was they sent my dad and other family members a draft of my book, and you know, said, hey, this is, you know, you've got so many months. I think it was around 6 months. You've got 6 months to tell us if there's anything untrue or inaccurate in this story.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, and my understanding is that he basically signed off on it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think he tried to correct a few minor things, But it was so inconsequential. It was like, I think there was a story about how, during times of financial struggle, my family was my parents were struggling to afford groceries and stuff like that. And so didn't have barely any clothes to wear. And, I was making Kraft macaroni and cheese with, I think it was just like milk or something because we couldn't afford butter. And, it was just like we were barely scraping by. And my dad would buy really expensive sports, athletic wear and stuff like that. And at the time, that was, another extension of the abuse. It was like, he felt that he was entitled to have, a $70, $80 pair of shorts. Meanwhile, we couldn't afford groceries. And and so that was a pattern of the abuse that I mentioned in Not Forsaken. And apparently that was one of the things, that he took issue with. Um, but yeah,
That tells you something.
yeah, there's always something, but it was
Well,
just
I
funny.
mean, of all the
All
things
the
he's
things.
accused of, to take issue with that my shorts didn't cost $78; they cost 604. You see what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
if a person is accused of seven serious things and one less serious thing, and the thing they want to make sure gets corrected on the record is the less serious thing, you got to
Yeah.
wonder, why don't they take issue with the serious things they're accused of?
Right, exactly. Well, and I think a large part of it was that, my mom and my sisters witnessed some of the incidents when he beat me up,
Mm.
or when he said or did sexual things. And so, there was a lot of stuff that he just straight up can't deny. And then, some of it I reported to the police, but, the statute of limitations was up, or there wasn't enough evidence for them to prosecute. But there are records, and there are definitely email trails, conversations between me and him, or me and family members, me and, church leaders talking about all this stuff. And he never denied it before. So it was kind of like, well, we've got documentation.
Well, I want to talk more about normalization of
Hmm.
abuse.
Yeah.
The When you live in an abusive situation, as you said, things become normalized.
Hmm.
And one of the things I see online or in other areas of discourse is more conservative people criticizing abuse victims for taking so long to
Hmm.
say this was abuse.
Yeah.
Can you explain why they might do that?
Yeah, there's a number of reasons. When you're dealing with child abuse, like I was, um, you might really think that a lot of abuse is normal. If you grow up in a situation where your dad beats you up and you're told that this is discipline, then, it might not even occur to you to tell somebody about it because you just think it's normal. Um, or your vocabulary might be very skewed. So, for example, I had a situation where this victim was saying that they were being spanked. And, but then it turns out they're being, I don't know, spanked with a 2x4 or something like
Wow.
that. And it's like, okay, that's not the same thing. And so what would happen is this child would go and tell their pastor, my dad spanked me, or tell their teacher, my dad spanked me. And nobody thought anything of it because to them, spanking means something entirely different. And so that's actually one of the tips that I give church leaders is, if somebody comes up to you and says, my dad does this, my dad does that, my dad has anger issues. One of the questions you can ask is, well, what does that mean to you? What does that word mean to you? What did that situation look like? And how did it make you feel? So, because that way you're getting beyond the terminology down to the definition of, okay, what does a child think that this means? That's extremely important. The other issue a lot of victims face is fear. They're afraid that their abuser will retaliate against them, possibly even kill them. My dad used to tell a story where he'd come home from work or whatever, or he'd be lounging around the house in his boxers on a weekend, and he'd say, "Hey, did you hear that story on the news today?" And I'd say, "No, I haven't heard, what are you talking about? We didn't watch TV today." And he'd say, "Well, this man came home and found his wife and his kids packing to leave him. And so he got his gun and he shot them all dead. And then he shot himself. And then my dad would turn to me and he'd look me dead in the eye and he'd say, 'You better never try to leave me.'" And it was very understood by me. And he would tell this story. He told it multiple times, the same story. And he told it to me. He told it to my mom, I think, and some of my sisters. And so it was understood that if we ever tried to leave or tried to tell anybody, what was going on, that he might go postal. And, so there's that fear. There's a very real fear. And I had recurring nightmares, I think, from the time I was probably 7 or 8 years old up into my 20s and even early 30s, of him breaking into my house or coming into my bedroom and murdering me. So the fear is a huge element. But not just fear of violence, also just fear of, being lied about. An abuser, especially even a nonviolent abuser, they can blackball their victim. Oftentimes abusers are family members or friends of the family. And so there's the fear that, well, if I come out and tell everyone what this person, this beloved uncle or father or even aunt or my mom, did, she's gonna or he's gonna call me a liar. And then what if all my siblings and all my cousins and my mom and dad and my friends, my church, my pastor, what if they all believe my abuser, or they start questioning me? So there's that fear. And also it's profoundly embarrassing and humiliating. Especially when it comes to sexual abuse, to have to tell someone, something that humiliating and degrading happened to you, especially if it happened more than once. A lot of victims have they mistakenly take responsibility, especially kids. They'll think, well, why didn't I tell him no? Why didn't I tell him to stop the first time? Why didn't I get help, after this happened twice? And so there's these layers of guilt and just humiliation in there that are very, very complicated. But I think finally, there is love. I loved my dad. I really wanted him to change. I really wanted him to get better. I didn't want him to get in trouble. I didn't want to, quote, ruin his reputation, end quote. I didn't want to humiliate him or get him arrested. I loved him. And I think that, a lot of victims, that's part of the confusion and the dichotomy we get stuck in. It's like we fear them. We might even hate them, but we also care about them or might maybe even love them. And so it's really hard. It's really, really hard.
As far as normalization goes, and the question of why abuse victims sometimes wait so long to say that what happened to them is abuse, is that abuse creates almost a kind of unconscious sense of reality in which abuse is acceptable, but it is pervasive. It becomes pervasive in a victim's mind. And you described all the motivations for waiting so long, but the problem is when people hear those motivations described, who've not been through a very abusive situation, they think that you're describing conscious thoughts that happen in a person's mind.
Oh, yeah.
And sometimes you are.
Yeah.
But for men, in many, many ways, in abusive situations, they create almost unconscious assumptions or even just a pattern of emotional response that the person is less aware of.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
And it takes a long time to become aware of that, of
Mhm.
those assumptions and of those emotional responses, because they can be very, very subtle.
Yes.
And in one of the interviews I heard with you, you said that you went through some of that process just when you first got married, of kind
Mhm.
of coming to realize what's normal, and having those unconscious assumptions challenged. Can you talk a little
Yes.
bit about that?
Yeah. So I married Jason, my husband, when I was 21. It's just that by the grace of God, I married a godly man. He was just very kind. Most of us have no idea what we're doing when we're 21. I
Hmm.
really had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know what godly masculinity looked like. I didn't have a healthy definition of fatherhood, or how a husband should behave, or what he should look like. And so I had a very warped perspective, even of love and of marriage, because of the way that I grew up. And so it was just the grace of God that I ended up marrying this guy who was just a really wonderful, uh, loving, faithful husband. And so I started to learn by contrast, um, how wrong my dad had been, how abusive he had been. So, for example, my husband cared about my ideas. He cared about my opinions and my feelings. And I remember at one point we were discussing, I think it was purchasing a vacuum cleaner, and he asked for my opinion and what my preferences were. And that was such a foreign thing to me, because my dad had never shown any interest in my personal thoughts or needs or emotions. It was actually in my home growing up. um Emotions were often shamed, especially emotions like sorrow, fear. um and so those emotions were viewed as shameful and as weakness, as something that was embarrassing, something to be quiet about. Whereas Jason was very interested in knowing how I felt, like really knowing and understanding me. And so I learned by contrast, uh, just how pervasive that abuse had been. There are other examples where, for example, my dad, when my dad would even touch housework, he was usually throwing dishes or something because he was having a tantrum.
Hmm.
And so the first time that I saw Jason washing dishes, it was jarring to me. Like, I actually started crying because I thought that maybe somehow I had failed in my wifely duties. I was not a good wife, and he was probably going to divorce me now because, I didn't get to the dishes before he did. And I started crying, and he was like, "Are you okay? I'm just, washing the dishes. It's not a big deal. It's just a few plates and some cups, and it'll take me 5 minutes." And so, but yeah, my whole lifestyle, my whole way of thinking, my whole understanding of gender roles, everything had to be turned upside down and inside out. And it did not happen all at once. It took several decades.
Hmm. You talked a little bit about responses you got from church leaders trying to talk about abuse,
Hmm.
and they were not wholly positive.
Yeah.
Yeah, you want to say something about that? Well,
Yes.
let me ask you the question. Here's the question I
Sure.
want to ask. You said, like in the case of child abuse, church leaders don't ask the follow up questions.
Hmm.
Again, it has been my experience that in almost every church I have ever known or been acquainted with, the spiritual life there, the intellectual life, the community life is
Hmm.
about as deep as the skin of an apple.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that most churches, and most everyone in their churches lives. Let's imagine we all live on an apple, and everyone lives on the peel.
Yeah.
And abuse drives you beneath the peel.
Yeah.
And so, if you're in that kind of situation, you are a person beneath the peel who needs help from people who live on the surface.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How does a person in that situation get anything that they need
Yeah.
from people on the surface? I suppose that's part of the work you're doing now.
Yeah, it's a large part of it actually. Just getting what I'll call normal people, if that's even a thing, people who are living in, mostly healthy relationships, have a mostly healthy spiritual life, who are not dealing with domestic violence, sexual abuse, child abuse, etc., and have never encountered it. Explaining it to them, it can be kind of like, sometimes I feel like I'm explaining an alien world.
Mm.
They don't understand how things like this could ever happen. And I'll use an example. I recently heard a sermon by a sweet guy, obviously a very godly man, repentant sinner. And he was talking about one of the sins that he'd repented of is he had reacted in a selfish way toward his wife. And his reaction was that he was going to get some potato chips, and she had picked up the bag and he'd snatched it out of her hands. And but he recognized that in that moment, he recognized that he had reacted selfishly and in anger, and that terrified him. And so he actually apologized and he repented and he changed his ways. Um, I think one of the things that we have to understand about abusers is abusers maybe started like that, 10, 20 years ago, but they didn't repent.
Right.
They kept repeating that pattern of behavior over and over and over and over again until it got worse and worse and worse, and it grew like cancer. And so by the time you reach the point where the abuser has beaten up his child or hit his wife or raped his wife, you're dealing with someone who has reached a level of metastasized evil. The sin has grown from that little kernel of selfishness, and it's spread throughout his entire psyche, his entire heart, his entire mind, and it's just rotted him like we sometimes say a rotten apple, and it really does. It infects the whole person. And I don't think most abusers even realize it. They're very good at acting normal in public, coming off as a friendly, maybe even godly person when they're around other people, people outside the family or outside that close circle. But the fact is that even that pretense of being nice and normal is a lie.
Mm-hmm. It's part of the
And
abuse.
so it's part of the abuse. Yeah. And so it's a lie. And so, one of the things that, I'll tell people when they come at me and say, hey, you're going to ruin this guy's reputation, I will say, no, I am fixing his reputation. I am making his reputation more accurate because this is who he really is. He's been lying to you all this time,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think it's helpful. I think in my work, I've described abusers as con artists. That tends to be something that people can wrap their heads around a little bit easier because, we've all gotten those crazy emails from the Nigerian prince who wants our bank account number or whatever. And, so if you can think of abusers as con artists, as people who pretend to be your friend when really they want something out of you or they want to hide something from you. It's helpful in, I think, helping people kind of grasp it because it's maybe a little more, we've all been, ripped off by door-to-door salesmen or, used car salesmen or whatever. And if you can kind of think of abusers in that category, it makes them a little easier to understand.
I think there are two obstacles in most church lives,
Mm-hmm.
the lives of most churches, that make accepting the reality of abuse difficult. The
Mm-hmm.
first one is a sentimentality. And I
Yeah.
think that many Christian circles are highly sentimental places where stories of very serious abuse are so disturbing they can't be faced.
Yeah.
I also think that there are many churches who place such an emphasis on the intellectual assent to doctrine that church life basically becomes about what you believe. And that
Yeah.
church, being a church member, is basically about verbally acknowledging that you hold to these abstractions
Yeah. The creed comes
and
back
then
to.
discussing ad infinitum the same abstractions.
Mm-hmm.
And that then results in people who have who are either very afraid to deal with concrete instances of evil, or who are just so incompetent at that because they do what they're good at, which is what they learn to do in seminary or whatever, which is to play with abstract concepts
Yeah.
and insist which ones are correct, etc. That they just don't have the skills for confronting evil at the level where it is necessary.
Yeah.
Have you found
100%.
that too?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, you're 100% right. Um, and I think that there's this misconception that if someone believes all the right doctrine, believes all the right, or claims to believe all the right things, that somehow they're a godly person. And therefore, when they say that they're sorry, we have to they're sorry, they're repentant, praise Jesus.
Mhm.
And it never occurs to people, well, what if this guy is lying? What if he's just saying he's sorry so that you won't report him, so that so that the abuse can continue, And so I think there's a shallow understanding of sin and of how serious evil is, um, and also how uh, powerful these sins are, like the damage they inflict on a person's soul. Because someone who has the capacity to molest a child or beat up his wife um, is profoundly damaged. He's built up a callus on his heart where he's become incapable of restraint in some ways. So he might not feel the inhibitions that a normal, emotionally, spiritually healthy person does. Because an emotionally, spiritually healthy person could not do that to a child.
Sure.
And so just the fact that he can tells us that something is deeply, deeply wrong.
Mhm.
And there's not an understanding of that in most churches. They think, oh, well, he said he's sorry, must be a one-time thing. We'll forgive him, like good Christians do, and pretend this never happened, and it will never happen again.
I
But
think
that's extremely naive.
yes,
Yeah.
I think too that these situations bring up a fear in certain Christian people and church situations that no
Yeah.
one ever admits to. And that
Hmm.
is, I think that in many of these situations, there is a fear that if the application of our theology here, right,
Hmm.
if that doesn't work to change him, maybe our theology is wrong.
Yeah.
And that
You're absolutely right.
nobody wants to confront that possibility.
Yeah.
And so when it doesn't work, we just have to drop it and move on because we can't ask the question, why did the best thing we know to do fail?
Yep.
And most Christians and most churches would be a million times better off if they would ask that question.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I think it's a failure too to acknowledge that salvation is the work of the Holy Spirit. It's like what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, if I speak in the tongues of men and angels, but I have no love, I'm a clanging gong. That perfectly describes abusers. Abusers are the epitome of that. They can have all the right words, but if they don't have love, if they don't have the Holy Spirit in their heart, it's meaningless. It's borderline irrelevant. And they actually do a lot of spiritual damage by saying one thing while doing another. The other thing that I think I've encountered is pastors and church leaders really hoping to have some sort of big, flashy Paul on the road to Damascus conversion story that they can brag about. Oh, yeah, this guy used to be a pedophile. This guy used to be a wife beater. But, then I intervened in his life and told him that God is love or whatever. And now he's a nice guy. Isn't this wonderful? Praise Jesus. And they want that so bad that they're unwilling to face the possibility that maybe this guy's a hypocrite. Maybe he's not Paul. Maybe he's Balaam, maybe he's Saul. um, not all, unfortunately, not everybody's going to be saved.
And
There are going to be false Christians in our churches.
and for abuse victims, one of the reasons why abuse victims tolerate so much
Yeah.
is they have a deep hope that somehow a miracle will occur and this
Yes.
person will change completely.
100%.
Now, that essentially never happens. If it ever happens, it's so vanishingly rare
Yeah.
that it virtually never happens.
Yeah.
And the church attitude that you're describing, oh, he's changed now, when he hasn't in fact changed,
Right.
reinforces to victims their own naive hope about this person.
Right.
And unfortunately, oftentimes the kindest thing that the church could say to abuse victims, I think, is simply, he's never going to change, she's never going to change, that person
Yeah.
will always be terrible, and you need to not be around them anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that it probably requires too much courage on the part of the church to say that.
Yeah.
And so they just don't. No one does.
Yeah.
When in fact, that is the thing that most people in abusive situations need to hear.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's biblical precedent. You think of Paul and Alexander the coppersmith. He warned people, hey, this guy is, he was abusive toward me. He was evil toward me. Beware of him. Have nothing to do with him. We read verses of, shaking the dust off your feet when you leave a town. There is biblical precedent for cutting people out of your life. If someone, Abigail, when what's his name, Nabal, her husband, Nabal, I think, or is it Naaman?
I've forgotten. Let's say Nabal. Naaman is the guy who gets killed in the river.
Yeah, she says, David's preparing to kill this guy and wipe out his entire family because the guy's a jerk. And Abigail, his wife, is like, you know what? I don't have to put up with this anymore. She goes to David and she says, my husband is an idiot and a drunk. Please do not kill his entire family. And and David relents. And the Bible recognizes Abigail for being incredibly brave and godly and wise because she did that. And so when we have an abusive husband or an abusive spouse or an abusive parent, and a victim comes forward and says, my husband, my parent, whoever, is an idiot and a drunk, we need to believe them and not shame them and not reprimand them or try to silence them, because the Bible actually tells us, you know what? It is godly to tell the truth. It is godly to protect others from trusting wicked people. It is godly to defend the weak, and so I think that we need to dust off that doctrine and dust off those stories and start reading the Bible more honestly and wholly, not just the happy stories, the scary stories.
Speaking of scary stories, churches are not obviously the only location where Christian discourse happens. And you and I, we know one another from Twitter, or what used to be Twitter.
Yeah.
And
formerly known as Twitter.
we probably run in a lot of the same circles there on Twitter. And there is, as you know, lots of discourse. I think the first thing to say is that people who aren't on Twitter and don't use Twitter, what they miss is the fact that Twitter really is the source from which all of our mainstream culture now grows.
Yes.
And that ideas that are now becoming mainstream have been circulating on Twitter for 7-8 years now.
At least. Yeah.
And one of the ideas that's discussed there a lot is there's a lot of gender discourse about within a Christian context there. And I don't know if we were taught if this was before we began recording or not, but you mentioned the TheoBros and their shall we say gender agenda.
Yeah.
I have on Twitter been quite vocal in my opposition to them. I was quite vocal in my opposition to them right up until the time that they all blocked me, and then there was no point.
Yeah. They blocked me too.
How would you define a TheoBro?
Yeah, I want to try to be as gracious as possible. There are some guys, they exist on a spectrum. First, let's start there. I think the very best of them are kind of starry-eyed young guys. They're usually in seminary or fresh out of seminary, or it's still teaching in seminary. And they really want to believe in this kind of Christic manhood, that men need to be stronger, better, smarter than women, and that it's their God-given role in life to lead women. And they don't mean that in a submissive, loving way. They mean that in kind of a pompous, domineering, controlling sort of way. And so they have a misunderstanding of what it means to be a leader. They want women to obey them, and they have a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be submissive. So you'll have, these guys who, they'll quote ad nauseum, that verse in Ephesians 5 where it says, wives, submit to your husband. But, God forbid you bring up verse 21 where it says submit to one another, or the many other verses. Like, I'm not going to remember it off the top of my head. I think it was in Philippians, but it's a verse where he's talking about Christian leadership and what that means and how our lives need to be a living sacrifice for one another, that we should treat one another as, being above ourselves. And so, they have this fundamental misunderstanding for how all of that works. And one of the things that and of course I said spectrum. So, and then on the very dangerous end of the spectrum, you have guys like, my dad, who took it to an extreme where basically men can do and get anything they want, and women should be quiet and submit and obey without complaining. Otherwise, they're not being godly wives. And so the misconception, the ideology feeds abuse and is incredibly easy to leverage for the purpose of abuse. Yeah, it's
One of the
scary.
things that I see on Twitter,
Mhm.
and which of course means we'll see it in the broader culture in a few years,
Oh, yeah.
is that liberal feminism is essentially dead.
Yeah.
And by liberal feminism, I mean sameness feminism.
Mhm.
What generally goes by just the term feminism, right? But there are
Sure.
many different kinds of feminism.
Yeah.
And especially in right-wing Twitter spaces where these things are discussed, where the TheoBros live,
Hmm.
you see many you it's very interesting because you'll see a lot of pushback against them from
Hmm.
women who themselves identify as traditionalists or complementarians or who themselves believe in wifely submission.
Yeah.
And and so it's interesting because we've kind of come to a place in gender discourse where what is being discussed is the meaning and role of submission
Yeah.
more than the question of whether women should submit,
Yes.
right? And
Yeah.
so this is what I mean when I say that liberal feminism is dying or dead, because there's almost a more realistic recognition that in relationships, gender dynamics are to a certain degree fixed.
Mm.
And so you'll see people, I think probably the most interesting one is someone like Radfem Hitler. I don't know if you're familiar with Radfem Hitler, but she's kind of a caricature, but she often posts these takes where she's very critical of men,
Hmm.
but at the same time, also very critical of what have traditionally been liberal feminist ideas.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so, and I can think of several Twitter posters, women, female posters, who take that same approach, though perhaps less extreme. And I'm just wondering what the antidote is to this kind of extreme woman hatred that is
Yeah.
often justified by a sort of loose application of Christian thought
Yeah.
if the answer is not simple liberal feminism.
Sure.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. And, this probably sounds cliche. I think the answer is humility and love.
Mhm.
I think that, once we start viewing each other as human beings, and this goes back to the effects of pornography on our culture, we need to start viewing one another as intelligent human beings made in the image of God, made as different, sure, but equal in value with valuable contributions to be made, to be enjoyed, to be honored. I think also that um, our not only in the church, in church gender roles, but also in our culture at large, there's this weird tendency to put people in boxes, to define people in very narrow terms. For example, you've got a lot of the trans ideology. And it's like you've got guys saying, well, I feel like a woman on the inside, or women saying, I feel like I'm a man on the inside, or, what have you. But then at the same time, you've got, these Christians who think that, oh, well, this little boy shouldn't be allowed to play with dolls, or this woman shouldn't be allowed to drive a tractor. And it's like, why? You
Mm.
know, are we really so closed-minded, so narrow-minded that we've boiled gender, our identity in God, down to the kind of clothes we wear or what we do for a living or our hobbies. I mean, it, and so, but it's all kind of the same misconception. It's like, no, I can actually be a woman and enjoy weightlifting. That will be, and a lot of people would think, what? That's so weird. Yeah. And, I also like IPAs, and it's just, but I'm still a woman and I still identify as a woman.
Right.
There's
Right.
nothing wrong with that. Um, and so it's just, I don't know.
I think
Weird.
I think it is endemic in much of the Christian world. Let me say, perhaps even especially in the Reformed world,
Yeah.
that there is a deep fear of getting anything wrong
Yeah.
and an accompanying belief that we know enough that we could get everything right
Yeah.
if we
That's
wanted.
very true. That's very
And that we can figure it all out. And people who won't accept our views of how every principle should be applied.
Yeah.
So the principle might be men should be masculine, women should be feminine. Okay,
Yeah.
great. But
Yeah.
what does that mean? And
Right,
there's
exactly.
no.
It's like the definition of submission. It's just like we're honing in on how we're defining words.
Mhm.
Yeah.
There's very little humility
Yeah.
about the idea that people have freedom, that we can agree on a principle and people have freedom about the applications of those principles. And that
Absolutely. Yeah.
submission, for example, wifely submission to her husband,
Hmm.
might not be a rigid thing,
Yeah.
but it might be a feature in relationships that is determined by culture, but more importantly, by the nature of the love and the relationship
Yeah.
and the personalities of the people involved.
Yeah.
And there's very little recognition of that. And so what happens is you get a social media environment where being inflammatory is incentivized.
Yes.
And so you get TheoBros who, for the sake of their own aggrandizement,
Yeah.
start insisting that everyone follow the most restrictive application of these principles
Yes.
possible. And then saying if you don't follow the most restrictive application of this principle possible, you clearly don't believe in the principle, which
Yeah.
is obviously false.
Yeah. And it slides into ridiculousness so quickly. One of the issues I encountered was I can't remember what I posted. I posted something about being grateful for my husband because he had gone grocery shopping or he'd run some errands for me or something like that. And one of those Theo bros, started trolling me, basically saying, your grocery shopping is your womanly duty. And if your husband is grocery shopping, then he's not being masculine and he's not managing his household well. And I was just like, have you lost your ever loving mind?
Yes, they have.
You're really going to define husband and wife, masculine and feminine, by who goes grocery shopping? Like, what universe does this make sense in? Just,
My guess
yeah,
is that those are people who've never been married.
he's apparently married. Oh, and then the funniest thing about it was that later on, he confessed in private that he actually does occasionally do the grocery shopping when his kids are sick.
There
So
you
it was
go.
like, oh, okay. So you're just saying shocking things on Twitter or X, formerly known as Twitter, for your stats to pump up your Theo Bro posse,
Mhm.
at the expense
Of the
of a
truth.
stay-at-home mom, who's just thankful for her husband. I mean, what does that say about a movement when the way that we try to preach our ideology or promote our ideology is by degrading others because they're happy?
We've been going for about an hour, and I know we have other things to do today. So let's leave it there on that note.
Yeah,
I think that's a good place to stop. Thank you very much. It was a
thank
very
you.
interesting conversation. I think it would be beneficial to lots of people.
Thank you, Dean.
Jennifer Greenberg, author of Tell Me Again.
Not Forsaken and Defiant Joy.
Go and so if you're listening, go buy those on Amazon or wherever. Thank you,
Thank
Jennifer.
you. Thank you.